Excellent. Let's get started. So a very good morning to all. Thank you so much for joining us at this morning's session within the Africa-Europe D4D Hub Multi-Stakeholder Forum, where we'll be looking at unlocking data governance potential for sustainable growth. So to promptly think through opportunities arising from this new European Union, African Union digital partnership and appreciating that data and a data economy bring huge opportunities but need to be managed responsibly. A very inspiring panel, I believe, has been convened by Vodafone and Vodacom across our two key geographies, and it will be multi-stakeholder in the true sense of the word, with our experts spanning several disciplines and organisation types. The scene is very much set for some practical suggestions on how to achieve robust, harmonized data regulations that can also ensure citizens can maximize the value of their data, and that we can make the most of this multi-stakeholder setup to consider how Europe and Africa can become joint leaders in trust and responsible innovation with data. So it's going to be just under an hour of jam-packed interactive debate. I'll introduce most of our panelists shortly, and we'll also keep time for Q&A from the audience. So please do ask questions for our speakers. I'll aim to take as many as we're able to within the time. But first of all, we have a keynote address provided by Professor Pamela Andanda, who joins us from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. So Professor Pamela, good morning, and thank you for agreeing to get us started with the session. And in your role as Professor of Law, how would you say we can look to unlock data potential for sustainable growth? What principles should guide data use? Who should participate in these decisions? What role for the individual, the company, the state? Much to talk about. What policies can be doing to increase trust and transparency? Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and a very good morning for me to be in this panel and to share my perspective with you. I hope that you can see my slide. Can you see my slide?
Yep.
Okay, thanks so much. So just starting with the first point on how to unlock data potential for growth, and a lot of things that I'm going to say are essentially taken from a project that we are currently working on that I'll mention shortly. It's very important to note that what we really need to unlock data potential is, first of all, an enabling environment. And this enabling environment requires a proper governance structure with clear responsibilities. That simply means that at least, the continent is quite diverse. The African continent is diverse, and as was recommended by the EU Digital Economy Task Force, we need to ensure that we have some harmonized national, continental, regulatory frameworks. So some consistency is required in that regard, and we have to be careful to make sure that regulations are enablers, that they don't hinder progress and obstruct responsible data sharing. So it has to be an enabling environment. And in terms of the proposed harmonization, I serve on the African Academy of Sciences Data Governance Committee. And what was suggested was that these governance structures should be based on a pan-African normative frameworks that reconcile competing societal, individual, and industries' interests in order to ensure fair sharing while minimizing legal and ethical risks. And so in the graphics that I have, what we're talking about is more or less the foundation of a building to predict what's coming on my screen. So this is the first pillar, where we need those very clear responsibilities in order to facilitate innovation and data sharing. And the main principles that we can think about, for instance, privacy by design, privacy by default. If we take care of data subjects, human rights and interests, then it will be much easier to build trust and people will be willing to share data. People will be more trusting in that regard. For instance, we need to make sure that there's equivalence in the different jurisdictions when we share data. A good example is South African Personal Data Protection Act, the POPIA, as we famously call it. If you look at Section 72, at least it requires that equivalence when you're sharing data across. Apart from that, we also need transparency and accountability. And this means that at least we can fall back on so-called custodial relationships, not just ownership that excludes certain people. So that custodial relationship is very important in this approach. It has to be a guiding principle. In our project, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust, and we're looking at data migration in sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to interrogate how we can use data trusts. You know, when you're in a relationship of trust, it's much easier to deal with each other. And you're able to trust that whoever's receiving your personal data will be mindful of your welfare and will use it properly. So that is more or less like a communitarian approach. And also facilitate transparency. We know how, for instance, the GDPR in the EU requires that equivalence as well, that whoever is sharing data with you should have an equivalent framework. And in our project, we came across jurisdictions such as Kenya. The Kenyan Data Protection Act explicitly requires registration of all data processes. And I think that fosters transparency. And maybe the EU GDPR, which sometimes says that it's not so easy to know how equivalence is established. In the Kenyan legislation, this registration process, the act is very clear on what you need to be registered, and you're only registered once you're assessed and you meet those requirements. So that pillar is very important in terms of the guiding principles. And the third pillar that also addresses one of the questions that I need to address is who should participate and what is their role? So participatory processes are very important. And here I can say that what has been established is that all devices that collect and enable us to collect data and share are actually embedded with technologies that are subject to very fast pace of change and development. We have so many actors who are involved in the application, usage, and all these stakeholders should be involved in this process so that we have an inclusive, what we call co-creative approach. And if we have a co-creative approach, where when we come up with regulations or any frameworks, every person has been heard. And that creates a sense of ownership so that people are able to embrace this process and feel confident that there's a certain level of protection. What happens is that if we don't co-create, don't engage with every person, then there's that feeling of unease. I realized, for instance, when in the Academy of Sciences, we recommended this harmonized approach, there's a bit of unease because the Convention on the African Community, that approach has not even been embraced by all the countries. So how do we ensure that everybody comes to the table? And I think the co-creative approach can be very helpful here. And maybe during the Q&A, I'll elaborate co-creative approach. And for me, what is really important here is that we also have that kind of collaboration, which has been called in the field of innovation as the triple helix of academia, industry, and government. But if we extrapolate that to the society, that's how the co-creative approach would work, because individuals, companies, and states can really play a key role in this space. And if we embrace these three pillars, then that's how we can have this comfortable roof that covers this a nice framework that we'd like to have in order to unlock data protection to facilitate growth. And what happens is that if these three pillars are taken care of, then we're able to have trust. We're able to make sure that everybody has a sense of ownership. Civil society organizations and everybody else feels comfortable to work in this space. So what role is play if that is the roof of our building? For me and my team members in the data migration project, we've thought that policies should be there to facilitate brokering of a holistic conversation about data. And it's this holistic conversation that will really create that enabling environment, will help us to make sure that nobody is left behind when we are regulating this space. We'll engage with community groups, members of the civil society, and establish equitable frameworks. Equitable frameworks cannot come in place without the three pillars that I've portrayed in these graphics. And I think this is the master key that we can use to unlock data potential if we put in place all these requirements. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And I hope that that has given us a solid foundation on which we can now have our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very solid foundation indeed. Thank you for outlining the vision, the key principles, and let's hope we do have time to come back to the co-creative approach later on in the session. That's very interesting to explore indeed. So great foundations, as you've said, for introducing our panelists. So what I propose to do is quickly introduce everyone before going straight into individual contributions. So we have with us Suhila Amazuz joining us from the African Union Commission. Good morning to you in Ethiopia. Good morning. We also have Bruno Gencarelli, Head of Unit for Data Flows and Protection at DG Justice in the European Commission, joining us from Brussels. Good morning, Bruno. Also Mikko Niva, Group Privacy Officer and Head of Legal for Vodafone Group in London. Good morning, Mikko. Geraldine de Bastion from Connective in Berlin. Good morning, Geraldine. And Teki Akuete, founder and director of the Africa Digital Rights Hub, joining us from Accra in Ghana. So the power of online sessions where we can group so many great experts from so many different places. And with that, straight over to Suhila. Good morning, Suhila. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much. Maybe in the first instance, could you start by explaining for us how the African Union is engaging in building a data protection framework in Africa, building on Pam's intervention? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I would start by thanking you for this opportunity to speak on this important panel. To respond to the question, how the African Union is building the capacities or engaging in the data protection. Last year, the EU Commission took the lead for the development of common approach on data governance across the continent that include personal, non-personal, private, and public data. At the end of the year, we came up with the Continental Data Policy Framework that was formally endorsed by the African Union Summit. So the framework aims to raise political awareness on the strategic importance of data and its relevance to the development of contemporary or modern economy and society, and also provide guidance for member states to develop their national data systems and capabilities to effectively manage and govern the data that being generated within their by their citizens, by their institutions, and also to stimulate, as a way to stimulate value creation and also the establishment of a new driven data economy. The framework also aims to encourage cooperation between countries and facilitate cross-border data flows by establishing the adequate mechanisms, institutions, and also building the necessary capacity in order to facilitate these data flows. And also we aim also to develop, to support by creating data sharing or data categorization frameworks where all countries, they agree on one format and also a standard that will facilitate the exchanges. So the framework also aimed to support and to enhance, because we know that there is a lack of harmonization at continental level. So aim to work on this aspect, to work towards the harmonization of data governance and data regulations and to reach a high level of convergence to enable interoperability of systems and also availability of data. We also aim to ensure that all data is being generated within the continent can be hosted by the by our countries, and also by supporting the development of national data infrastructure and also regional data infrastructure. And also to respond to the question on what principles that guide this activity and what will be the target of this framework. The principles that are mainly based on aspects related to data justice, the ethics, and also the protection of digital rights of African citizens. While we agree with European vision about the human-centric, but from our side we have the human rights, but also we have the development-oriented aspect, because we really aim to use data to address to address our lasting development challenges. And data is a great opportunity for us to improve the delivery of public services, and also to come up with evidence-based policies, and there is really discussions on how to harness the potential of data. So the principles, they are based on cooperation, integration, inclusiveness, trust, and also accountability, because we aim to develop accountable and trusted cross-border mechanisms. When it comes to personal data in particular, I would say that on the legislative part was addressed by the Malabo Convention, which was developed by the African Union and was adopted in 2014. Now we are in the process of ratification. We have reached 13 ratifications so far, and the Malabo Convention sets the principles that will guide the processing of personal data, and identify the principles that will guide this, and also the role and duties of the data protection authorities, and they will be regulating the transfer of data and use of data across the continent. I think the Malabo Convention is comprehensive enough, as it addresses also the rights of the data subjects and duties of the data controllers. And at the same time, also we are working with sister organizations as we support the development or the establishment of the network of data protection authorities across the continent. And also we work with other partners in order to build the capacity, and also to create space for data professionals in order to exchange and create that data ecosystem and uniform data ecosystem and digital data market across the continent. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, very comprehensive. And I think maybe when we come back to the Q&A, because I think there's also Africa's role in shaping that international data framework, how Europe and Africa can work together, that maybe when we've heard from other speakers, we can come back to. So thank you so much. And let's move to Bruno Gencarelli. Bruno, good morning. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Building on Suhaila's thoughts there, I think it links to what you might be able to tell us quite nicely, both on the sort of data flow, harmonization, and looking at rights and infrastructure. So maybe, Bruno, would you be able to provide us a short overview, first of all, of the main concepts around GDPR and its universal principles, trust, transparency, transfer mechanisms, just to come back to that. And then maybe after that, we'll move on to some of the legal challenges. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here with you today, and also very pleased that this dialogue takes place in the broader context of the new Africa-Europe digital economy partnership. I think that to answer your question quickly, it's very important to first of all realize why protecting privacy is important, and then to see how this can be operationalized in modern frameworks. I think Professor Adanda already very well dealt with the concept of trust. I liked very much what she said. Trust, it's about enables us to deal with each other, and that's true in many contexts. To also echo what has just been explained in the personal data protection guidelines for Africa that have been adopted in the framework of the African Union on the basis of the Malabo Convention that was already mentioned. Those guidelines rightly emphasize that trust enhances reputation and can deliver a competitive advantage. But of course, privacy is much more than it is an economic opportunity. Lack of absence of data protection rules can hamper trust and thus negatively affect trade. And investment by privacy is also much more than an economic opportunity. It is first of all a question of human rights. I like to mention a very important judgment of the Indian Supreme Court of a few years ago that says that privacy is an essential element of our identity and dignity as human beings. In fact, without privacy, there's no space where me, you, all of us are free to think, develop our own ideas, experiment and pursue our life as we deem fit. Privacy is also an increasingly democratic imperative at a time where the very functioning of our democracies, including the integrity of our electoral process, can be threatened by misuse of data. And this is why privacy is intrinsically linked to democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and good governance. This is probably truer today than ever before. Strong data protection safeguards are necessary to ensure that new technologies bring opportunities instead of contributing to inequality. So modern data protection regimes have to, I would say, address those different challenges and opportunity from a human right point of view, from a collective democratic and development, I totally agree, point of view, but also privacy as an economic necessity. And certainly there's no one-size-fits-all approach to privacy. However, most of the new data protection regimes that we're seeing in many parts of the world, and I will probably come back to that, including in Africa, share a great deal of commonalities, and essentially around two or three main elements. First of all, comprehensive legal frameworks covering both the private and public sectors, rather than sectoral rules. There is a need, for all the reasons we have already mentioned, for common rules of the game, and also to enable data to move across sectors, across industries, between the private and the public sector. And if you want that, if you want to have to both create legal certainty for commercial operators and public operators, but also trust for citizens, that we need to be sure that whoever process their data, this is done on the basis of a number of safeguards. You need comprehensive legal framework. Another element, which is, yes, reflected once again in the GDPR, but in many other frameworks around the world, are core principles such as lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data security, and accountability, to just mention a few examples. And what does all of this tells us about data protection rules? This is not about, as sometimes we hear about, prohibiting the collection or the processing of data. It's about ensuring, as you also have already said, that collection and processing of data takes place in a certain framework that ensures that collection and processing of data is done in a responsible, trustworthy, and unaccountable way. A third element of commonality of modern framework is the existence of enforceable rights of individuals. Data protection framework are there, first of all, to allow individuals to gain or regain control, at least some control over the data, to enable citizens, and therefore rights such as access, rectification, deletion, and others are typically found. A further element, and I'm almost done, are safeguards for international transfers to enable cross-border data flows by ensuring that the protection travels with the data. We very much believe in an approach that does both, protects data, and by protecting data also enables transfers of data. And this concept, which I can, if you want, come back to later on protection traveling with the data. And then last, but certainly not the least, independent oversight by a dedicated supervisory authority and effective redress, so the governance aspects. The role of data protection authority, privacy commissioners are very important. Somebody already, I think, mentioned indeed Kenya, where we see a very good and active data protection authority. So the idea that you need an authority that is if you want point of contact, a friendly point of contact, a user-friendly point of contact for individuals in particular. You don't want all these requests and queries to necessarily go to litigation or the courtroom, but you also need a data protection authority to adapt the rules to developments, commercial developments, technological developments that are of course happening very quickly, that could not be foreseen often at the time when the data protection legislation framework was adopted, and you need that an independent, neutral, as is what I call a honest broker to guidance and other measures adapt those rules to that fast evolving environment. So this, I would say, brief, and probably have already been too long, in few words, what I believe are the core elements of a modern data protection framework.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I mean, it's comprehensive and very helpful, and what I hope we'll get to come back to do with you as well as think through the future of those agreements in a bit more depth after we've heard all the speakers. So I hope that's all right. Thank you very much. And let's move now to Mikko from Vodafone. Mikko, good morning. Europe and Africa are, of course, Vodafone's homes and deployed GDPR globally. So wondering whether you could firstly tell us something about this experience and any lessons learned, and also whether you could give us examples of data use insofar as how it delivers societal and economic benefits, and what barriers, if any, you're facing in trying to achieve such benefits. Thank you, Mikko, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, as you say, we run a global privacy program, which is very much based on the GDPR. So we apply this standard, this high standard, in all countries where we operate, in Europe and in Africa and also elsewhere. Why did we come to this conclusion? Well, the first principle for us was that privacy is a human right, and we believe human rights are enjoyed by everyone, not only by those who happen to have a national data protection law in place. So we for us it made a lot of sense to adapt this position. The other thing, obviously, is that Vodafone has hundreds of products, thousands of systems where data is being processed in various ways. So we do need to have a robust framework to ensure that we respect our customers and employees also. It's not only about customers, it's the employees as well, rights in this, let's say, very complex environment. So in terms of our experiences, I'll start with the positives. When we started to roll this GDPR program, we first deployed it in Europe, and then we moved to Africa. That process is largely completed now, so I can look back and reflect. So I would say very positive experiences. I always felt that people were actually quite excited to be involved in this process. It never felt like we were doing something that people would be strongly opposing to. Instead, it felt like we were kind of like meeting a demand, and that I think was a very positive realization. I would also say that we have very impressive teams, very skilled, very competent people in our organization, very advanced technologies in our country. So it was kind of like an exciting technology and compliance and policy process. You also kind of get further evidences for the fact that I think many of us in global companies have kind of like understood already for a long time that the privacy principles are actually broadly the same everywhere, and this is a good basis for harmonization. The differences are then in the sort of like the lower level of how, but you know, the why and the what are very much harmonized at the global privacy principle level. So privacy is very much about building a trusted relationship, as the previous speakers have also mentioned. So concepts like privacy by design, they make a lot of sense. people will understand that it's better to build it from the beginning. But of course, not everyone thinks of it actively unless there are privacy professionals to remind them and perhaps guide them through the process. Moving on to the kind of like some of the challenges, perhaps. So privacy, or should I say, data protection law? It's a new right. It's in Europe, for example, it has existed for a long time. But it really has become alive in a really robust sense since the GDPR. So it's in African continent. It's a fairly immature concept in a number of different ways. So legal frameworks, we need to have more, better, more harmonized legal frameworks. We have countries that it's mainly regulated through some, kind of like derivations from constitutional law. Maybe it's in consumer law. So more harmonized, more sort of like solid body of law would be welcome. The oversight authorities, as Mr. Gencarelli also mentioned, that we need authorities that are also available to organizations, not only to the individuals. They need to provide guidance. They need to be there to help organizations do the right thing. The enforcement of the law then needs to be done in a strategic way, taking into account all the relevant rights and interests that are at play. And finally, the scarcity of resources, expert resources. We do need to do a lot of work to build those professional communities, privacy professions. People need to see that that's actually a viable career option. There needs to be certification programs. There are international organizations such as the IAPP, International Association for Privacy Professionals, for example, that could be really helpful in achieving that. Data sovereignty. Privacy is not at odds with free flow of data across borders, but we do see this worrying trend of data localization type of ideas. They will have a big impact on a financial and organizational and technical impact on all organizations, and that is not going to be good for companies who want to offer their services to global audiences. EU, I think, serves as a model here with its challenges, but it is an area within which data can flow rather freely, and also the data from the EU can travel outside EU, provided that the rights and obligations travel with the data wherever it goes. It is a good model. Whatever models the African continent comes up with, they will need to be interoperable with that EU model, but also with the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Forum cross-border privacy rules. It's a complex thing, but that needs to work. If I have a few minutes to mention some of the data-related opportunities that we've exploited. So we want to build a really like a sustainable digital society that respects privacy, but also creates opportunities to benefit from the data and the digital opportunities, as was mentioned in the first speech today. So these are not mutually incompatible objectives, and it's great opportunity. So we've been active in African markets in healthcare, for example. In Lesotho, we have a mom and baby solution that provides health and wellness content covering from the pregnancy stage up to 5 years of child development. Very, very useful. In logistics, we have something called Vodafone Stock Visibility Solution. So this is kind of like a supply chain management service that provides real-time supply chain information, enabling proactive and data-driven decisions. M-Pesa, very, very impactful digital financial service that is really has had a transformative impact. Mobility insights during the COVID pandemic. So we actually used the information that is available in our networks to understand how populations are moving. So you can actually measure how the quarantine and the lockdown measures are actually working. Now, the balance between privacy and this data usefulness was about making sure that we only share anonymous and aggregated information, and we build in the security and privacy controls in that analytics process to make sure that we are not putting individuals' privacy at risk. And we did fairly complex data ethics type of analysis as part of that as well. So very active, many opportunities. Let's make sure that we will have the legal frameworks that allow these opportunities, but also that takes into account privacy, trusted relationships with the customers and employees.
Thank you so much, Mikko. And again, as with the speakers before you, really bringing out the importance of both the legal frameworks and what practical initiatives look like and how they work together. Picking up on several speakers are also mentioning interoperability, which is very much at EU level a buzzword. So let's see if we can come back to that too. And let's see also what we can do in thinking more about the infrastructure layer. Excuse me, a bit later in the session. But now to move to Geraldine. So Geraldine, a warm welcome, and we're thrilled to have you here because thinking of the small medium enterprise perspective too in your work with Connective. So wondering what framework, as far as you see it, would need to make for an inclusive data economy, making sure really that it benefits small companies and innovators as well, as you've seen in your experience. And we also understand that you get to travel through Africa, meet African innovators. And could you maybe share some examples of inspiring data for good business models as you see it? Thank you, Geraldine.
Right. Thanks so much for having me here. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, my work with Connective, but also with the Global Innovation Gathering, which is really a network of innovators, makers, and innovation spaces. So they work either developing and bringing forth startups or digital initiatives that are very much sort of shaping their digital scenes and economies, and of course, working actively along the issues that we're discussing here today. First of all, let me say, I think a lot has already been said in regard to creating inclusive frameworks. Obviously, that we need this idea of creating new sort of checks and balances between citizens and governance, between digital initiatives, be they private sector or civil society, and governance, in trying to create these new frameworks that really enable a more democratic and transparent system of data governance than we've seen so far. So there are, of course, a number of great models arising, but I think what is important to point out is that what we really need to be looking at is to see how can we create structures that enable us to use data as a common good, source for common good, and that is something that can be used by private sector entities just as by public sector entities as well, rather than perhaps creating new models or business models that push for the economization of personal data. So as we're discussing concepts of data stewardship and data trusts that have already been brought forth by my fellow panelists, I think it's very important to lay attention on the question, where do we create new opportunities through that without putting further pressure on the individual to monetize their data? So there are great companies coming up in Europe, and I'm definitely not bashing anybody's business model here, but companies like It's My Data, who are creating sort of more commercial or startup-y versions of these data trust and data stewardship models that then those sort of follow the philosophy perhaps more of Jean Larrière along the lines of being able to also monetize this personal data in different ways. And I think that can create a very, let's say, dangerous perspective, also not in a European, but also in development contexts in different ways. So that is perhaps something to look out for. You asked me for good examples of business models. So leading software company person recently said to me, companies that create business models that exploit the data of their customers are not good business models. A sound data-driven business model is never going to exploit the personal data of their customers. It will only use the data of their customers to offer really like individual customized experience from those data points to that customer, but it will work with aggregated data, anonymized data to innovate and build its business model. And I think a lot of founders are getting that right, which is the opposite of the big platform companies that we've seen emerge from the US. And I think a lot of data-driven startups today would agree that that is not the kind of business model we want to strive for, and are really building opposite models to those, which I think is very refreshing to see. We have a really great popping startup scene also here in Berlin, and I'm meeting increasingly founders who have a very, very strong mindset of innovating along the lines of GDPR, innovating driven by the new AI directive of the EU. So very much embracing these regulatory approaches and regulatory measures as their framework of innovation. I'll just give you one example of a company called Breta AI that works with creating, let's say, just to make it very easy here, technically very simplified, fake faces of people, allowing the AI to still train rather than using pixelation. So faces can be used, however, it will not be real people faces. So this is a way to train AIs being used in public contexts that will allow total privacy for the individual, but still a learning curve for their technology. And I think that's very inspirational. And like I said, I think there are a number of founders that have embraced that mindset, both in Africa and in Europe, and are working exactly along those lines. There are also a number of fantastic civil society projects that are really empowering their communities to have a voice, let's say, at the data table. Initiatives like Data Labby from Brazil, numerous citizen science projects across Africa. You can all check out Africa Osh, for instance, that are really enabling citizens to also be data gatherers. Many of you will be familiar with projects such as Make Sense from Barcelona, etc., where censuses are distributed, created by citizens for citizen science projects, them being able to engage, for instance, in city planning processes by gathering their own air pollution data or such thoughts, and therefore engaging in policy dialogues because they had the access to their own data. So I think a lot of these grassroots initiatives coming forth, whether they're civil society or private sector based, are very exciting to see and definitely need attention or need strengthening and support as well. I could go on to talk a little bit about the necessity of creating public open data repositories in these contexts and more level innovation playing fields. Maybe just one very last note on that, which is also why the topics that have been raised by my fellow panelists about standardization and interoperability are so important, but also about transparency and openness. One more example from Germany would be that we lock up a lot of the data that we have and do not make it publicly available. For instance, public transport data, which very often is only supplied to Google and large platforms that then create their services on top, but is not available for innovators, for startups, for civil society groups. So we really need a change in approach to what data sets we open up through open repositories. And here there are many lessons learned that we can draw from other countries that have worked with such systems on a more long-term scale. For instance, countries like Estonia, where they are seeing what tweaks to put on their open data repositories to again make sure that they are used primarily for common good applications and not just for individual companies to profit from. So I think those are some of the things that we need to pay attention to in order to create these level innovation playing fields and really supporting some of these grassroots initiatives in order to create these new checks and balances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Really useful, and it does strike me too that some of the things you were mentioning about use of data from certain business models, AI and so forth, of course in the European Union there's a whole raft of regulation underway at the moment. If we think of on AI, for example, or on digital markets, digital services, it's a long list underway. So we'll see in a couple of years' time when those are enforced, what the impact of those is and whether there's any benefit to SMEs from that regulation too. Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes left and we very much need to hear from Teki. And then what I'd like to do is also come and do a quick closing round to everyone where we hear about the more forward-looking aspects of how we can build this partnership. I just want to very quickly read the essence of a comment that's come in on the chat about data governance being a pillar of infrastructure for resources, and that we could think about other pillars in terms of transfer, storage, global processing. Again, Gerald, you mentioned some of this. So, for example, with agriculture, needing to assure a national approach to that infrastructure, and that there is eventually connectivity and interoperability indeed. So good to see the impact across different vertical sectors there being considered by viewers. So last but absolutely not least, we come to Teki. Good morning, Teki. Thank you for your patience in waiting to intervene and noting your work's focus on digital rights, which of course several intervenants have mentioned as being of central importance. What do you think about citizens' perceptions of increasingly data-driven societies? And if we think of the EU-Africa digital partnership that we now have to build on, what key principles do you think should be reflected from a citizen's perspective? Thank you, Teki, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara. Do I have my 5 minutes or I have less? Okay, all right, thank you. I just wanted to know. What do citizens think of the data-driven societies that we have in Africa? I do not even think that we are in a place where I would say that we think, you know, bad or ill of it. I think that it is important to premise this on where Africa is today. We see technology as a continent, and as a continent of 55 countries, let me just put that. We see ICTs as an enabler to development. And in the last decade, we can confidently say that the ICT sector has been one of the fastest growing sectors that we have seen across Africa. We've also seen that it has also been a key enabler to critical sectors that have always been part of our economies, like the health sector, like agriculture, like education, and the like. And so we are seeing a very, very growing data-driven society across the many countries that exist in Africa. What tends to be happening, which may not be so good, however, is that when it comes to the frameworks and that actually support and enable citizens, you know, derive the most benefits, protect them in terms of the utilization of these ecosystems, we see that we are more contributing, our citizens are more contributing to the growth of the data-driven economies, but benefiting less and less and less from the sector as a result of a number of challenges that we continue to see. These challenges, I think, have already been highlighted. There are challenges around the kind of regulatory frameworks that we're seeing in place across countries. There are challenges around even where these regulatory frameworks exist. There are challenges around implementation of these frameworks in a way that really enables and protects them. We should also be very mindful of the fact that Africa has, or most countries in Africa have a very large informal population. And look, if you look at a lot of these frameworks, we can even talk about just language, right? Let alone look at the technical manner in which these frameworks are developed. If you look at it, you can sit down and say that we are not necessarily developing these frameworks to support our citizens and our people. Why? One, because of language. I set up the Ghana's Data Protection Commission some time back based on the law that we facilitated in the development of. And I remember at the time of implementation for a framework like data protection, awareness of citizens is very key. But if you have a very large informal sector with many other languages, right? The question then is, and most of these laws are also developed in English and are meant to support, you know, people who may read the English and even in technical language. So you need a lawyer to understand, to interpret all of these things. So there's not enough, you know, that is being done to really empower the citizens to benefit and make the most of this. I'll give you another example. We are all excited about the Africa Free Trade Area. However, again, a large majority of Africans fall, and especially women, you know, work in the informal sector. We have made significant strides with the mobile money industry where a lot of these traders are able to trade. But the question is that are the protocols that we are building, how are we involving the informal sector around the protocols that we are building to make sure that they can participate effectively in the 3 billion market that we are. We're still sitting at the table with the big boys and the big girls, and my grandmother in the village that has the farm, it is very likely will be left behind in this. So yes, there is excitement and technology is doing amazing things. We are looking at the policies, but I think particularly from the African perspective and also from, you know, global perspectives like the EU, the US and other, we need to start looking at how do we make sure that this industry really benefits the people in the space. Because currently, if you ask me, we're still a significant contributor to the data economies, but we are benefiting less and less from, you know, the benefits that can be derived from these potential that the data, you know, the data-driven economy will present to Africa.
Thank you so much, Teki. It's very powerful to hear from the citizens' perspective and really how bringing home, I think, quite powerfully how we need to make sure that nobody gets left behind and that we really bring everyone on board with this journey, including the informal sector. Thank you. So very mindful of the short time. This was always going to be the case with so many brilliant speakers convened. What I'd like to do is just have a final closing round, so maybe some key takeaways from all of you. Bear in mind we have 5 minutes, and in a forward look sense, so what is the future? And I know Suhila, for example, had some views on like Africa's role, maybe with Bruno thinking what we'd conceived originally to think through the future of international data transfer agreements, and for other speakers, and certainly maybe with a closing note from Pam on any sort of key takeaways or learnings from this session of what you found inspiring. It's very short, so if we can please all be concise, that would be great. And Suhila, let's start with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe from my side, I have mentioned what the African Union and Africa in general are doing to strengthen cooperation between countries to enable and to ensure that data is processed in safe, secured, and responsible way that protects the rights of citizens, and also enables the intra-Africa trade and online activities. But also we are also working towards strengthening and enhancing relationship with other regions when it comes to data-related issues, while at the same time preserving the interest and the national sovereignty of our countries. I think the adoption of the data policy framework shows the political will of our countries to work on this strategic area. And also, if we take into account that Africa is a market of 1.3 billion people, and now we are in the process of digitalization of all sectors, and also there is a space for investment and also for development of innovative solutions that may respond, and also we aim to come up with our own solutions that respond to our context and our technological reality. When it comes to our relationship with other regions, I think we have already overall partnerships that are already there. We have relations with all countries and regions in the world. We can just include the data component in the cooperation and also include it in the trade agreements, that in a way that will facilitate trade between Africa and other regions. And also when it comes to cooperation specifically between the Africa and the European Union, since it is the object of our meeting, I think there is space to engage together in developing capacity building programs, like there is sharing of best practices and experiences, and also to come up with the necessary regulatory reforms and to come up with adaptive systems that will enable the development of new businesses and also creation of new opportunities for people from both sides. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Important to bring in the role of trade there indeed. Bruno, how about you? How do you see the future of international data agreements? Noting the Schrems II decision, it's a hard area.
Yes, well, we don't have much time. So what I've essentially done is that I've taken note of what has been said, and I very much agree on what has also been said in terms of awareness raising, involving everybody, making sure that everybody is on board. Meaning, this is not only, we are not only addressing the business community here, we are addressing first of all our citizens in both the EU and Africa. And I think that here is where indeed capacity building and other measures that are there to promote a good governance structure, including around data protection authorities and privacy or privacy commissioner has a role to play, because those governance structure, when they function well, can indeed bring everybody on board. And the EU has a specific program which aims precisely at developing, that also has been said, those exchanges of knowledge, best practices, experience, and we are already engaging bilaterally with a number of countries on the African continent, from Senegal to Rwanda, from Ghana to to Kenya, just to mention a few examples. But I think that indeed there's also a need for, and that's the purpose of our meeting today, for regional dialogue, including to get to where meaning to the issue you mentioned, how to facilitate data flows. That needs to be, meaning, there are now elements, and that's the promising part of it. There are already elements of convergence. There are, as I said, commonalities between many regimes. The Malabo Convention can also play a role. When you facilitate data flows within a region, you also facilitate data flows between that region and the rest of the world, including the EU. As you know, in the EU, we have a number of tools to do that. What I want to say, because there's sometimes I hear some misunderstanding. We are not. This is not about requiring the photocopy of any rules. This is about really building on elements of convergence, commonalities between our rules and those of the countries of the region in question. We are, I think, working very successfully on that with a number of actors around the world, in Asia, in Latin America. And clearly there is already, and there will be more engagement in Africa, both bilaterally and with the African Union, and we are very much looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Bruno. And I understand Geraldine unfortunately has to leave, so please do look at her closing statement in the chat box. Thank you so much, Geraldine. Really aware of time pressures, so if everybody else could just really give a quick word to close, maybe Miko will come to you.
Yeah, very quickly. I hear a great sort of a common agenda developing here. I think that is really encouraging. I think there will be a lot of very practical work ahead to reach that vision. So we have to be patient, but make progress. You know, every day, every week, every month, every year. These things are slow to create, but if we set ourselves for a common target, we will be more likely to get there instead of somewhere else in a foreseeable future.
Thank you, Miko. Teki?
Thank you, Lara. I think my final words would be around, we've heard a lot about harmonization, which is important to facilitate cooperation between AU and the EU. But I want to say that we should look at harmonization even within Africa, between Africa and the EU, from the perspective of commonalities and not uniformity. I'm saying this because the differences, there are significant differences between us. And the more we continue to look at, uniform laws, uniform systems, I think that it creates a gap rather than the bridge that we need for the collaboration which is required. And time is not on our side. So that's what I would love to end on, commonality instead of uniformity.
Absolutely, the diversity there is to be embraced. And Pam, thank you. You've listened very patiently to lots of interventions. Maybe a very quick closing word from you, and then I'll close the session. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. My final statement is that a lot of times we focus on fixing the systems and infrastructure, and the real assessment of human rights, social impact, and equitable issues can escape our attention. For instance, when the private sector takes the lead, they need to work closely with the state so that the state does not become disempowered. So if we have the regulatory frameworks in place and the private sector is working closely with the state, it's a real powerful alliance. And that also helps us when we frame issues of privacy and data collection as security issues. Sometimes we overlook equitable issues. But that's the holistic approach that I would recommend in a conversation moving forward. And I think it will be a brilliant integration and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And speaking of integration, cooperation, it's been a great session, but unfortunately it's time to close. As a multi-stakeholder forum, of course, the aim is to very much keep working together with to support an inclusive digital transformation. So hopefully some of the great ideas we've heard this morning and examples have great futures ahead of them. Thank you so much to our very thought-provoking speakers. So Dr. Pamela Ndanda, Suhila Mazuz, Bruno Gencarelli, Mikko Niva, Geraldine de Bastion, and Teki Akuete. And thank you to Vodafone and Vodacom and the organizing teams from the forum for organizing and for inviting me to take part. It's been a real pleasure. So all my best wishes. Let's build on the buzz around this event.